White cop lies about black woman in court, not knowing she's a high-ranking Navy SEAL. A lie in a courtroom can destroy an entire life, unless that life belongs to a true warrior. Monday morning, at the North Crest County Courthouse, the early sunlight cut through deep crimson velvet drapes, casting slanted beams across the polished ebony floors. The courtroom bore the stately design of 19th-century buildings, its 6-meter-high vaulted ceiling carved from oak, pew-like benches arranged in solemn rows. But today, no one was thinking about architecture. No one cared about beauty. Every eye was fixed on one black woman sitting at the defense table. Susan Wilson, her hair neatly tied in a bun, a crisp white-buttoned shirt, black slacks pressed to perfection, did not look around. But from her composed posture, from the way she sat upright with her hands gently resting on her knees, there was something about her that made it impossible to look away. There was no panic, no fear of someone accused of assaulting a police officer. No pleading gaze, only calm, like she knew something the rest of the room hadn't yet figured out. At the plaintiff's table sat Officer Mason Rodriguez alongside the state attorney. His Lakefield County Police uniform was freshly pressed, his nameplate gleaming under the lights. He whispered occasionally to his attorney, occasionally glancing at Susan with a smug half-smile, the smile of someone used to winning cases without breaking a sweat. Behind them, the gallery seats were packed. Local journalists mingled with curious residents. A few held up phones, secretly recording. Whispers rippled across the rows. "She punched a cop, I heard." "No, I heard she's ex-military." Just another anti-police stunt if you ask me. Judge Joseph, a white man in his early 60s, round glasses, and a warm, gravelly voice, entered the courtroom. Known for his stern adherence to rules, no bias, no emotion. This court calls case number 1427, the state of North Carolina versus Susan Wilson for the alleged assault of a police officer while on duty. Susan lifted her head, and at that exact moment, her eyes, sharp, still, unflinching, met the judge's gaze. These were not the eyes of someone on the defensive. These were the eyes of someone who had stared danger in the face and never backed down. This story isn't just about a court case. It's about a truth buried, a person misjudged, and a system about to be shaken from within. Because Susan Wilson is not just a black woman. She is a Navy SEAL lieutenant commander. And this time, the truth isn't backing down. An intense and powerful story is unfolding. To follow the rest of it, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss our next gripping episode. The gavel struck the polished ebony floor 3 times, echoing through the large courtroom like a warning. "Court is now in session," Judge Joseph declared, his voice steady but heavy with authority. His silver hair was neatly combed, thin-rimmed glasses perched low on the bridge of his nose, and his sharp gaze swept across every face in the room. He paused just a moment longer when his eyes met Susan Wilson, the silent woman seated at the defendant's table. "State of North Carolina versus Susan Wilson," the court clerk announced loudly. The prosecutor rose and turned toward Mason Rodriguez, the police officer waiting with an air of absolute confidence. He stepped onto the witness stand, as if onto a stage. His Lakefield County Police uniform was crisply pressed, nameplate centered on his chest, firearm holstered, but still at his side, as if to remind everyone. He was the guardian of order. "Your Honor," Mason began, his voice deep and clear. "That night, I was dispatched to respond to a serious domestic disturbance in the Riverbend neighborhood. Upon arrival, the defendant, Susan Wilson, was behaving erratically. She was shouting, non-compliant, and when I instructed her to calm down, she assaulted me, using her elbow, then shoving me to the ground. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear a pen fall to the floor. Mason seized the silence, continuing to paint his picture of guilt. I attempted to de-escalate the situation, following proper intervention procedures, but the defendant continued yelling, using offensive language and displaying open hostility. We had no choice but to subdue her. His tone was even, precise, as if rehearsed in front of a mirror night after night. He glanced toward Susan, not with the look of someone traumatized, but with the smugness of a man who had just moved a key piece on the chessboard of power. He knew what would happen next. The jury would sympathize, the public would stay quiet, and a black woman would once again be automatically deemed a threat. Susan didn't react. No raised brow, no shake of the head. She simply stared ahead, her eyes sharp and unmoving. If anyone looked closely, they would see the patience in that gaze, not born of fear, but of certainty. She knew the truth would come, and when it did, it wouldn't scream. It would arrive like a silent storm, strong enough to sweep away every lie. Mason stepped down from the stand. The prosecutor nodded, visibly satisfied. Across the room, the defense attorney, Thomas, a black man in a gray suit, placed a hand gently on Susan's shoulder and whispered something to her. She gave a small nod. No grand strategy needed, because in a true battlefield, the best soldier is the one who knows when to strike and when to stay silent. Judge Joseph adjusted his glasses and jotted something into his notebook. Then he said, "We will hear the defense after the recess. Court is adjourned for 15 minutes. And as people began to rise, turning to leave the courtroom, there was only one person who remained seated, motionless: Susan Wilson. Her eyes still fixed on the witness stand, where a falsehood had just been erected, like a fortress built of sand. And her? She didn't need to speak, because the truth was already beginning to rise. All eyes in the courtroom turned toward Thomas, a young black attorney, just 26 years old, and barely a year out of Howard Law School. His gray suit was slightly wrinkled at the elbows, his collar damp with sweat, despite the room being cold enough that some people had wrapped scarves around their shoulders. He rose from the defense table, clutching a folder, as if he were holding not only a woman's hope, but his own honor. "Your Honor," Thomas began, his voice slightly hoarse but firm, "the defense is ready." That voice made Susan Wilson, the woman seated beside him, tilt her head slightly. She didn't need to speak. Her eyes gave him a steadiness no textbook could teach. They were the eyes of someone who had lived through moments when no one believed her, and survived. Judge Joseph nodded. "You have 15 minutes for your opening statement." Thomas took a deep breath and stepped toward the podium, as if entering a place where the weak were not allowed to tremble. He opened the file in front of him, but didn't look down. Instead, he looked straight at the jury, 8 white, 3 black, and 1 Latin American. And he spoke. "Mrs. Susan Wilson, the woman on trial today, is not just an ordinary citizen. She is a veteran, a law-abiding citizen with a clean record spanning over 15 years. During her military service, she was a tactical commander on special missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. But here, she is not seen as a former officer, but as a threat, simply because of her silence and the color of her skin." A few jurors raised their eyebrows. Thomas continued, slowly but without hesitation. "Officer Mason Rodriguez described Mrs. Wilson as aggressive, non-compliant, and dangerous. But I ask you, members of the jury, if she were truly a threat, why is there no injury, no solid evidence beyond the testimony of one man, a man whose body cam just happened to malfunction at the critical moment?" A quiet murmur rippled through the room, Thomas took a step forward. We will show that Officer Rodriguez's testimony contains multiple inconsistencies when compared to eyewitness accounts. We will show that Susan Wilson is not the only one on trial here. There is also a system of prejudice, one that's grown accustomed to assigning guilt to people of color before any evidence is even considered. This time, Judge Joseph's gaze lingered a little longer on Mason Rodriguez's face. But Thomas didn't stop there. He held up a sheet of paper. Mrs. Wilson was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal in 2014 for protecting her team during a raid in Helmand Province. It is documented, verified, and witnessed. He paused, glancing at Mason. Things his testimony lacks. By this point, no one still thought of Thomas as an inexperienced rookie. They saw in him not superficial confidence, but strength forged through truth, discipline, and righteous anger. He looked towards Susan. She remained motionless, as still as a drawn bowstring. Thomas knew his role was only to steady that string, and the battle had just begun. But those holding the swords never expected that they would be the ones under scrutiny. Susan Wilson stepped onto the witness stand like a soldier entering the front lines, not clad in armor, but wrapped in lethal calm. She wore a simple white shirt, sat upright, her gaze cold as morning frost. When Judge Joseph gave a nod, Susan adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began. Around 6:35 that evening, I was standing outside Lavender and Pine Cafe at the corner of 7th and Pine Avenue on a phone call with a colleague in Virginia, she said, clearly, steadily. I left the military 8 months ago. I now work at the Naval Intelligence Analysis Office in Baltimore. She paused. The room fell silent. I was in athletic wear, nothing unusual. But as I ended the call, a patrol car pulled up to the curb. Officer Mason Rodriguez stepped out, said nothing, pointed and barked, "ID. Now." A few people in the room frowned. A woman in the third row shook her head and exhaled sharply. Susan continued. I asked why. I explained I was on the phone and had done nothing wrong. But he yelled, said I was being difficult, then yanked my arm and slammed me onto the car hood. While handcuffing me, he leaned in close and said clearly, "Women like you need to learn obedience." Whispers broke out across the courtroom. A journalist scribbled furiously like they were writing a breaking headline. Jurors shifted. Some furrowed their brows. Others glanced at Mason. Susan remained composed. No head shaking, no tears. Just precision, like a military report. At that moment, the prosecutor, a brown-haired man in a striped shirt, rose and slowly approached the stand. He smiled, not warmly, but with a carefully concealed contempt. "Mrs. Wilson, thank you for your statement," he said in a neutral tone. "But do you have any evidence, video, audio, witnesses, to support what you just described?" Susan raised her head and looked him straight in the eyes, unwavering. "Number, I didn't record anything. I thought I'd be treated like a citizen." A faint scoff came from the back rows. The prosecutor nodded, as if he had just played a winning move. He flipped through his notes, and before sitting down, added casually, "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. We all know memory can falter under stress." Susan didn't rebut, but her eyes, in that moment, were no longer those of a witness. They were a strategist's. She didn't need to shout the truth. She knew. If she held firm, the truth would speak for itself. Judge Joseph tapped his gavel lightly. Statement entered into record. Thomas, the young lawyer, looked at Susan, heart tightening. He knew she wasn't shaken, but he also knew people were quick to dismiss a black woman's word if lacking physical proof. But the truth always leaves a trace if one knows where to look. Susan stepped down from the stand. As she passed Mason, he looked at her and smirked. but the smirk lacked the confidence it once had. It was the smile of a man who knew he had lied and could now feel the heat of truth creeping up his neck. The trial was far from over, but the wind was starting to shift, and Susan, the woman once seen as the ideal defendant, was now forcing the courtroom to confront one urgent question. Why had someone like her become the target? And who, in truth, still had innocence to prove? The air in the courtroom seemed to thicken after Susan's gripping testimony. But at that moment, Thomas, the young attorney, slowly stood up, holding a USB drive. The faint blue light from the projector flickered like a beacon, signaling a turning point in the entire case. "Your Honor," Thomas said, his voice steadier than before, "we request permission to present a video recorded by a witness who was near the scene that evening. The video is not long, just 1 minute and 42 seconds, but I believe it holds significance." Judge Joseph nodded. "Permission granted." The screen lit up. The footage trembled slightly, likely shot on an old phone, but the audio was chillingly clear. "I'm not resisting. Let go of me." Susan's voice rang out, steady, unwavering, and not raised, amid a busy street. And then, another voice, dry and hostile. "You don't get to question me. Shut your mouth and get in the car." Mason's face briefly appeared on camera, eyes bulging, hand yanking Susan's arm violently behind her. She didn't resist, arms held close to her body. Her eyes turned to the camera, an expression not of pleading, but of someone who knew exactly what was happening. As the video ended, the courtroom nearly erupted. A journalist from the North Crest Tribune leapt to her feet, scribbling furiously. An elderly woman in the third row gasped, "Oh my God!" A group of law students in the back whispered to each other, phones lifted to snap photos of the screen. Judge Joseph immediately struck his gavel 3 times. "Everyone sit down. Maintain order in the courtroom." Mason Rodriguez, who had been sitting tall, now began to lower his head. His face flushed crimson. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and he clenched his fist so tightly his nails dug into his palms. Thomas didn't smile. He simply stepped forward, removed the USB from the projector, and turned to the jury. The video is not fabricated, not CGI. It was recorded by a civilian and has been verified by forensic analysts, with metadata confirming the exact time and location of the incident. He looked up, eyes sharp as steel. That wasn't the defendant's voice. That was the truth, captured. Judge Joseph remained pensive. He didn't speak immediately, but his eyes had changed, not scrutinizing Susan as a suspect anymore, but seeing her as a critical witness in a case of abuse of power. Rodriguez made a motion to stand and say something, but Thomas quickly interjected, "Your Honor, we have also submitted the identity of the person who filmed the video. That witness is ready to testify if needed." The courtroom fell into a heavy silence, a silence loaded with consequence, like a punch to the pride of a man who once assumed his badge gave him the right to abuse. Susan remained seated, but her eyes were no longer defensive. They gleamed with something else, the beginning of a pursuit for justice, not through loud words, but through undeniable truth. The trial wasn't over, but its balance had shifted, and Mason Rodriguez, though not yet convicted, knew now. The badge he once believed was a weapon, today had become the evidence against him. The small house at the end of a quiet street in North Crest, where Susan Wilson had lived for the past 8 years since retiring from the military, was no longer just a simple home that night. Inside, the warm yellow light illuminated an old wedding photo, a slightly crooked framed certificate of honor, and a glass case holding a precisely folded American flag, the symbol of a soldier who once served in combat. Thomas sat silently on the sofa. His hands were still trembling slightly after the emotional courtroom session that afternoon. Susan, dressed in simple everyday clothes, held a worn leather folder with frayed corners. Without a word, she placed it on the coffee table between them. "You have the right to know," she said, her voice low but clear. "Tomorrow we'll finish a trial. But if I stay silent about this, we might only win half the battle." Thomas opened the folder. The first page took his breath away. Name: Susan Maria Wilson. Rank: Lieutenant Commander, Navy SEAL. Service period: 2002 to 2022 campaigns. Operation Freedom Sentinel, Afghanistan. Operation Ocean Shield, Somalia. Operation Inherent Resolve, Syria. Attached was a document over 40 pages long, each line listing a commanding officer, a combat mission, a high-level evaluation, and on page 19, the emblem of the Silver Star. Below the citation, awarded for extraordinary heroism under enemy fire, extracting 3 wounded teammates from the combat zone in Kunduz, Afghanistan, 2013. Thomas couldn't believe his eyes. He touched a black and white photograph of Susan in combat gear, her face covered in dirt and blood, yet her eyes, still as resolute as they were today. "You're a Navy SEAL?" he said after a moment of stunned silence. Susan nodded. "And that's the one thing Mason Rodriguez could never have imagined." She continued, "I'm not bragging. I never brought my rank into civilian life. But if the court asks who I am, I will answer. Not to defend myself, but to remind people like him that wearing a uniform doesn't give anyone the right to trample others." Thomas closed the folder, his eyes clearing through the fog of fatigue. "You're not just a witness," he said slowly. "You're a key figure in redefining justice in North Crest." Susan said nothing. She simply reached for 2 cups of tea. Outside, the wind passed through the window, carrying with it the gentle echo of the quiet street. "Tomorrow," she said, "will no longer be about a wrongly arrested woman. It will be about a nation that's forgotten how to treat people fairly. And we're going to remind them." Thomas nodded. He knew that the next morning, when they stepped into that courtroom, they wouldn't just rely on the law, but on a truth too powerful to be hidden. That black woman was not just a citizen. She had once been a living shield in the heart of a battlefield, and now she was the one reigniting the meaning of the word justice. The next morning, the North Crest County Courthouse was no longer just a place for routine hearings. The hallways were packed. Journalists stood shoulder to shoulder filming. Cameras panned continuously toward the main entrance, where Susan Wilson was making her way in. Unlike her composed, quiet demeanor from the day before, today Susan wore a dark navy suit, epaulets perfectly straight, and a small silver pin in the shape of an anchor on her chest, a discreet emblem of a retired Navy officer. Her hair was neatly tied back, and her eyes shone brightly without a trace of hesitation. She didn't walk. She moved as if leading a parade. Judge Joseph straightened up as she approached the witness stand. "Miss Susan Wilson, please rise." She nodded, adjusted the microphone, and when she spoke, the entire courtroom fell silent. "I am Lieutenant Commander Susan Maria Wilson, United States Navy, SEAL Team. I served for 20 years, including 7 years commanding special operations units in Afghanistan, Somalia, and Syria." Something cracked in the courtroom. Not a physical sound, but the invisible rupture of truth shattering prejudice. Mason Rodriguez, seated with the prosecution, looked as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. His face turned pale. His hands clenched into fists without lifting. His eyes tried desperately to avoid the woman he once shouted at on the sidewalk. Susan continued without pause. "I coordinated hostage rescue missions under enemy fire, received the Silver Star, and was one of the first officers deployed alongside Delta Force during the Sinjar Mountain operation in 2016. All eyes turned toward Mason. Behind him, 3 uniformed officers in dark blue, those who had been present on the first day of the trial, lowered their heads. One leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "He dishonored a battlefield hero." They no longer wished to stand on the same side. Thomas, the young attorney, rose from the defense table. He stepped forward, his voice steadier than ever. "Your Honor, the defendant is not just a citizen wronged by abuse of authority. She is an officer who swore to protect this country with blood, sweat, and silent sacrifice. Something none of us, not even Officer Rodriguez, can fully comprehend." Judge Joseph couldn't hide the shift in his expression. He adjusted his glasses and slowly looked from Susan to Mason. "Officer Rodriguez, do you have a response?" Mason stood, but no words came out. His mouth pressed into a tight line. The confident voice he once carried at the start of the trial had vanished amid the click of cameras and the flutter of reporters flipping their notepads. After nearly 20 seconds of silence, longer than a career can stand before the weight of justice, Mason finally muttered a single phrase, so faint it was barely audible. "I didn't know." Susan looked at him, not with anger, not with blame, but with quiet resolve, the gaze of someone who had stood at the edge of life and death and no longer needed to shout to prove her worth. The court adjourned for a 15-minute recess, but for Mason Rodriguez, those were the longest 15 minutes of his life. Everything he had built, his image, his credibility, his so-called uniformed authority, was crumbling before his eyes. Not because of a lawsuit, but because the woman he had once dismissed turned out to be someone who had defended even his right to live. And now, justice was reclaiming every drop of stolen honor. As the trial resumed, Thomas, usually reserved, had become the courtroom's quiet storm. He didn't rush to the lectern. He walked slowly, deliberately, placing each folder on the table with both hands, as if laying down evidence at the altar of justice. A strange silence blanketed the courtroom, as though everyone could sense the storm about to break. "Your Honor," Thomas began, his voice calm and resolute, "I present internal documentation from the North Crest Police Department concerning the prosecution's witness, Officer Mason Rodriguez." He opened a brown leather folder and began reading each line clearly. February 4th, 2021. Accused of forcefully grabbing a 15-year-old boy during a pat-down without a search warrant. No disciplinary action taken due to insufficient evidence. July 12th, 2022. Accused of using vulgar and offensive language toward a single black mother in a hospital parking lot. No disciplinary action due to blurry camera footage. March 9th, 2023. Internal report filed for abuse of authority, illegal vehicle stop, and searching a student's backpack. Suspended for 2 days for behavioral retraining assessment. The first 3 records caused the jury members to exchange glances, but Thomas wasn't finished. He held up another document. This is a memorandum from Internal Affairs, dated November 27th, 2023, indicating Officer Rodriguez was recommended for reassignment on at least 6 occasions for inappropriate conduct, but each case was dismissed for lack of serious threat. Whispers rippled through the room. Cameramen zoomed in. Journalists typed furiously. One juror, Mrs. Williams, 62 years old, sighed and said aloud, "That's not a protector of justice. That's someone who abuses it." Mason began to lower his head. The arrogance in his eyes from the previous day had vanished, replaced by a lost, anchorless stare. Even the prosecuting attorney said nothing. He simply picked up his glass of water, his hand trembling slightly. Judge Joseph sat still for a few seconds, then nodded. He leaned toward the court clerk and signaled for a recess to review the documents. But before officially pausing the proceedings, he made a statement that stunned the courtroom. Justice does not rely on the loudest voice. It relies on evidence, and today, that evidence is questioning the very system we once believed to be infallible. Thomas returned to the defense table. Susan, the woman he was defending, looked at him and said nothing, but her eyes held unwavering trust. In that moment, they were no longer just attorney and defendant. They were the embodiment of something greater, a fight against the silence of the system. Outside the courtroom, the crowd grew larger by the minute. Many held signs. Justice for Susan, end qualified immunity, and badge not equal to innocence. On social media, the phrase Rodriguez Files began trending, becoming a symbol of everything the system had tried to hide. 3 hours passed after the jury withdrew to the deliberation room. No one left their seat. The breaths in the courtroom seemed to align with the ticking of the antique wall clock. Thomas clenched his hands, eyes fixed on the door to the left, where the jury would emerge. Susan sat upright, though her deep breaths betrayed the tension beneath. She wasn't afraid for herself. She was thinking of those who believed in justice, but had never heard its voice. The door opened. 12 members walked in, each with a different expression, but their eyes were unwavering. The foreperson, a middle-aged Asian woman, about 5 feet 5 inches tall, stepped forward to the declaration podium. Judge Joseph asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The woman nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We have. Please read the verdict." She opened the folder and spoke slowly, clearly, enunciating every word. In case number 23-467B, the state of North Carolina versus the defendant Susan Wilson, we find the defendant not guilty on all charges. The room exploded. A wave of relief. A shout rose from the gallery. "Yes!" Several people stood up and clapped. Thomas froze for a moment, then burst into a laugh laced with emotion. Susan only bowed her head slightly, not crying, not trembling, like a soldier walking off the final battlefield. Mason Rodriguez remained seated, frozen in place. But what came next silenced the room again, not out of fear, but sheer surprise. The jury foreperson continued. In addition to the verdict, we recommend that the court request an independent investigation into the professional conduct and ethical standards of Officer Mason Rodriguez, based on evidence presented during this trial. A wave of gasps swept through the room. All eyes turned to Mason. Judge Joseph didn't flinch. He nodded slowly, his gaze firm as stone. The court acknowledges the recommendation. Mr. Rodriguez, I strongly advise you, hire an attorney. This is not over. The silence didn't last long. A reporter stood and pulled out a recorder. A young officer stepped away from the police seating area and laid his badge on the table. Susan saw this, not with triumph, but with the solemnity of someone who's witnessed too much. Outside the courthouse, hundreds had gathered. When Susan stepped out, a sustained wave of applause erupted. She said nothing. But as Thomas turned to leave, she stopped him and said one thing. "You didn't just win this case, Thomas. You brought justice out of the pages and into the real world." Media outlets erupted with headlines. Navy SEAL overturns false charges. Police officer faces investigation. The Susan Wilson case, when justice wasn't blind. A new declaration for the disbelieved. That night, the video of the verdict was shared nationwide. On Twitter, the hashtag number #JusticeForSusan reached the top 3 trending topics in under 2 hours. A fresh wave of calls for law enforcement reform surged, but this time It had a real face and a real name. Susan Wilson. And in a small house on the west side of the city, where an American flag hung in a wooden frame, Susan stood silently. She didn't need titles. She didn't need thanks. She needed only one thing: that from now on, if a black woman was stopped for no reason on the street, someone might remember this name. And no, she once stood up, not for herself, but for everyone. When Susan Wilson stepped through the gates of the North Crest County Courthouse, she didn't just walk out of a trial. She stepped into history. Dozens of camera lenses followed her every step. Reporters crowded in, microphones held high, and questions flew from every direction. "Lieutenant Wilson, can you share how you're feeling right now? Are you planning to file a countersuit? Do you think this will set a precedent?" Susan paused at the stone steps, where sunlight hit directly onto the national emblem mounted above the courthouse entrance. She turned, looked straight into the crowd, and spoke slowly. "I didn't fight because I was offended. I fought for thousands of people, those without titles, without cameras, without power, and without a chance to push back." Then she turned away, leaving behind a stunned silence. 6 months later, evening news on ABC. Officer Mason Rodriguez has been officially dismissed following an internal investigation confirming false testimony, unnecessary use of force, and violation of civil rights. The North Crest County District Attorney's Office states that he will face state-level criminal charges, including abuse of authority and perjury in court. The National Police Oversight Watch, NPOW, listed Susan Wilson's case among the top 10 cases that shifted public perception of law enforcement in 2025. As for Susan, she returned to the silence she had always known, not to retreat, but to choose where her voice mattered most. In November that same year, she was invited to speak at the U.S. Naval Academy graduation ceremony in Annapolis, Maryland. Her speech was brief, just over 1,000 words, but interrupted 3 times by standing ovations, especially when she said, "Honor doesn't come from a rank. It comes from how you act when no one is watching. And courage? It's when you know you could be crushed and still step forward." The flag she had kept with her for 20 years, folded neatly in a glass frame, was presented to the Academy as a symbol. A replica now hangs in the main reading room, engraved with the words, "For those who stayed silent too long, and the one who didn't." At justice reform conferences, Susan's story is referenced as a necessary turning point. Civil rights organizations like the NAACP, ACLU, and the Innocence Project invited her to serve as an honorary advisor. She declined most offers, but accepted one from a local library in North Crest to lead a legal skills course for Black youth, co-taught by her and Thomas. Every Saturday, from 9 to 11 a.m., Susan stands beside the whiteboard, while Thomas runs the slides. They don't talk politics. They teach rights. They teach how to interact with police, how to handle unwarranted stops, and most importantly, how to never let someone else rewrite your truth. One afternoon, a 15-year-old boy, Jaden, asked, "Weren't you scared, standing in court?" Susan smiled. "Yes, everyone's scared. But if you're not scared at all, maybe you're not standing for something that matters." Then she looked straight at the boy, her voice firm. "But if you're ready, then you'll never have to stand alone." In a world where truth is often twisted by prejudice, the story of Lieutenant Susan Wilson stands as a reminder that silence is not always the safest choice, and that honor isn't worn on a collar, it's lived through action. She didn't just stand up for herself. She stood for the thousands who have no voice. If you believe in the power of truth and courage, join us. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Black Strength Stories so you won't miss the next powerful tale.